The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Welcome to Getting to Know You. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to James Ketterer. He's from Bard College, but he's a native of Saratoga. He's an expert he's the Dean of International Studies at Bard and the Bard Globalization and International Affairs Program. He was on the staff for the National Security Council. He has a whole page here about international and Mideast studies, which is way too long to get into, but we'll get into that. So welcome, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. You were sort of an expert in the Middle East. You were in Egypt from 2011 to 2013. Let me just go back to a little bit about your schooling and everything. How did you get interested in international affairs, and particularly the Middle East, this area?
You know, and everyone asks that. They want to know. I think if I were a chemistry major or an English major, they wouldn't ask me how did I get involved in that. But yeah, how does a guy from Saratoga end up studying the Middle East? And growing up in a small upstate town, I was interested to find ways to explore the world, but I didn't have a lot of opportunities to do that as a kid. And so when I got to college and I was taking a degree in political science.
And this is at Fordham?
This is at Fordham. Okay. I took a course in Soviet studies back when there was a Soviet Union. This was still the Cold War, and it was the hot topic in the Cold War. I ended up not really clicking with the course for some reason. It just didn't really interest me enough. And so it was around the time that things were heating up in Lebanon. The U.S. Embassy had been bombed. The Marine barracks had been bombed, and we lost over 200 Marines. Israel had invaded, and it was in the midst of the Lebanese Civil War. So it was on the front pages of the New York Times all the time. So I thought I would take a Middle East studies course. I didn't know a lot about the Middle East, but had grown up with family friends who were from Syria. I knew the food, at least, and so I took the course and liked it and found that as I studied more, I could understand more of what was in the newspaper. I started studying the language, and it just took off from there. So it really is a story of finding the right course with the right professor at the right time.
And what was the name of the class?
I think it was something like Comparative Politics of the Middle East and North Africa.
Well, one thing that isn't, you talk about this is interesting. When you talk about the Cold War, it was more of a us, them, I'm simplifying this, us, them, communist democracy, Russia. The Middle East, it seems like it's not just a boom. The issues are way more I don't know what the word is, not as definable. It's more than just democracy, communism. Is it a wider range of,
Well, for sure. And when the Cold War ended, at the end of the 80s and in the early 90s, it seemed that democracy was on the march, and that democracy was breaking out all over. That turns out not to have been the case, but it certainly seemed like that at the time, except for the Middle East. Mm-hmm. The Middle East still seemed very much locked in time, and it was largely a domain of long-standing dictatorships, people who had held office for decades on end, and perhaps handed over office to their children, either because it was a monarchy or because that was just the nature of politics in that country. There's Syria or other places. So when the Arab Spring started in late 2010 in Tunisia and then spread to Egypt soon thereafter, it seemed that things were finally catching up. But you're right that
You mean from 89?
From 89, that the Middle East hadn't kind of caught up with the end of the Cold War, and it appeared that it might be, at least for a little while.
Oh, okay, and then you were, you said you took what language did you take?
I took Arabic.
Oh,
Yeah,
you
I took Arabic in school, and I studied Arabic in various programs overseas. I did a summer program in Morocco. I studied for a year at the Bourguiba Institute of Living Languages in Tunisia, which is part of the University of Tunis. I was there on a Rotary Fellowship. So it's been a labor of love with Arabic.
So you, doing all this international studies and things, how did you end up in 2011 actually being at the sort of the right place at the right time? Or
Well, I was working at the State University of New York at the time. I had been the director of the Center for International Development for many years, and then had moved to a different position at SUNY, where I was the deputy provost and then the vice chancellor for policy and planning. In the midst of that, as things started changing in the Middle East, I really was inclined to try to get back to the region, because it seemed like something really positive was going to happen.
had you been there before 2011?
Been to the Middle East?
I mean, been to Egypt?
I had, on trips, but I had not lived there before.
Right.
I'd lived in Morocco and Tunisia, but I had not lived in Egypt. So as this was happening, I was in discussion with Amethyst, this educational and cultural affairs non-governmental organization based in Washington and located in most of the countries of the Middle East. And they were looking for a new country director based in Cairo. So this seemed like a wonderful opportunity that I really couldn't miss, even though I had a great job at SUNY and it was wonderful to be here in Albany. It was just too interesting, too exciting, too important, and so I made the move to Egypt.
What does Amethyst do, or what did they do? They're still there?
They're still there.
What do they do?
They're located across the Middle East and North Africa, in nearly every Arab country, with a few exceptions because of security issues. And they do educational and cultural affairs programs, working with the U.S. government, working with host country governments, working with private organizations to carry out things like scholarships, student exchanges, promoting U.S. higher education, English language training. They also do all the testing of things like SATs, GREs, the test of
So you ran their office
language
in Egypt,
right?
For the whole country,
right? And they have a large office in Cairo. They actually have two offices in Cairo. It's a city of 20 million people, and they have an office in Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast.
Cairo is 20 million.
It is.
I mean, I think we forget how. That's way bigger than New York City, even.
It is. It is. Although, I mean, Cairo is a spread out city,
like Los Angeles.
Like Los Angeles. So if you took New York City and then added in New Jersey and Connecticut and the Westchester region, it might be relatively the same.
So you got there in where? Was it in May of?
It was in May of.
Were things just quieting down from the Arab Spring right around then, or was it?
Well, it was a time of great optimism. The revolution had happened in January and February in Egypt. It had happened a little bit earlier in Tunisia. Things were changing, it seemed, across the region quickly. But Egypt is really at the center of the region. I mean, geographically, it's at the center. It's the largest country in the region, and it's just culturally the point at which people pay a lot of attention. So when something happens in Egypt, people pay very close attention to what's going on. And there was a sense that a dictator who had been in power for 30 years, that a structure that had been in place since the early 1950s was changing, and that people would have more of a say in how their government was run. Now, what exact form that might take was still very much in question, but the air was filled with this sense of optimism and possibilities in the spring of 2011 and into the summer. Unfortunately, as time went on, it became clear that what we thought was deeply revolutionary in Egypt wasn't quite as revolutionary, that the Egyptian military hadn't really given way, that the leader, Hosni Mubarak, had given way, and his family was charged, and the clique around him was either in exile, on trial or in prison. But for the most part, the basic state structures, the military, the security services, the other structures that have been in place since the early 1950s remained in place and were very resistant to change. Even when there were parliamentary elections, even when there was a presidential election, and Mohammed Morsi was elected as president, coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, even after that, he stayed in office only 1 year. Then he was ousted. Controversially, people would say it was a coup d'etat. Other people would say it wasn't a coup d'etat. But he no longer remained in office, no matter what we would call it. And that optimism, by the time we get to 2013, had largely dissipated.
But when you were there for those 2 years, 2011 and 12, was there a feeling that perhaps things would get better or more, I don't know, should I use the word democratic? I don't know.
There was. Democratic is a contested term in the Middle East. Contested because in many ways it's seen as something that has at times been foisted from the outside, sometimes by force. At other times it's seen as not culturally aligned with the traditions of the region. All of these things are very much up for debate. But however we define it, I mean, I like the definition of just having more of a say in the way that your own locality is run, that your state is run, that your country is run. And there was a real sense that people would have more of a say.
So by 2013 had it just sort of dissipated and...
Well, revolutions are also very chaotic events. And so this led to a breakdown in law and order. That the police had largely been targeted as the main culprits in the previous regime. And so the police were very constrained in what they might be able to do after the change from the Hosni Mubarak government. And so in a city of 20 million people, when you start to lose the sense of law and order, you start to see not only a higher rise in crime, but also acting out in political things in a more violent kind of way. I mean, nothing like what we see in Iraq or Syria or something like that, but still more violent than people had been used to. So the chaos of all of that then also led to sort of a grinding economic slowdown, in tourists coming to Egypt, which is an important part of the economy. And so people started to associate the revolution with chaos. And the chaos was clearly not a good thing. And so that was really very problematic. You also had then, a contestation between some major political forces, particularly the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. And the military aligned with the old regime, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had not really played a part in the revolution. And the people who had carried out the revolution didn't feel that they were really part of what was happening post-revolution, that they had been edged out.
Do you see them possibly, I mean, after the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, it took China a while, but China seems to be going more capitalistic and everything. Do you see Egypt possibly following suit the way China might be going?
Well, the China model is certainly one possibility in Egypt. If we look at models outside the region of the Middle East, this combination of state-centric, controlled system, but at the same time opened up to a capitalist market that could develop, and by developing, then start to change the nature of the society and of politics. We've seen this model in various forms happen in Asia. People would refer to the Asian tiger example as one of those models. This has not been a model that has been particularly effective in the Middle East up until now. That having been said, Egypt is the kind of place that has enormous potential. It's not an oil-rich country, although they do have some, and there's the possibility of discovering more. But the human capital there, the centrality of the location, the tourist potential, if they can regain that market, despite the chaos and despite the violence, it is a country that really could very much take off economically. The question is, will that economic change necessarily lead to societal and political openings in a way that it hasn't really done so before?
Now, that kind of change you're talking about for the Middle East, do you see it the most possibility in Egypt as opposed to the other countries in the Middle East?
Well, going back to our conversation about the Arab Spring, these changes, these uprisings, these changes in government did not affect many of the countries in the region. In fact, we see that most of the monarchies in the region were unaffected by this. So places like Morocco, Jordan, many of the Gulf countries that are monarchies. And these are not monarchies like the European monarchies that we're used to, where really the monarchy is a vestige of a time gone by, but the country is governed by a different democratically elected political system. These are
the monarchs who actually rule.
These are monarchs who actually rule. And they have been relatively insulated from these changes that have taken place over the past few years in the Middle East. And by being insulated, they have also found ways to develop economically. Some of them have vast resources, like in the Gulf region. Some of them are developing more slowly, like Morocco and Jordan. They don't have those same sort of resources. But how much political change is possible in those political systems is really a question. So Egypt is at the center of things. It does have great potential, but there are things going on in other parts of the Middle East that rarely get reported in the United States.
Well, that's one thing I want to ask you is, our perceptions here in America are through various media, be it newspapers, magazines, blogs, shows like 60 Minutes. Do you think, you lived there, are we getting I don't know, is this the right question? Are we getting an accurate picture of what is actually going on there through our various media, or is it misinterpreted? Not misinterpreted. Are we getting a fair and accurate?
Well, I think some of it is just the nature of the media. Not just our media, but the nature of media in general. The old saw that if it bleeds, it leads. And there's no market for reporting good news or reporting on just day-to-day activities. So what leads are often the most violent, the most dramatic sorts of things that are happening. And there are no lack of them in some areas in the Middle East. Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, dramatic political events with Saudi Arabia and Iran. But the reality, the daily reality of what's happening in the Middle East is that people are living their lives. There are interesting sort of local, personal stories that go on. There are, for instance, in Cairo, there is a burgeoning group of entrepreneurs, startup community. There are lots of interesting cultural, artistic innovators across the region.
But they don't make the news.
They don't make the news because it's not news in many ways. It's not news in the way that our media is used to reporting news.
Okay. Well, are you still in touch with people from Egypt?
Oh, yes.
So is there a sense of optimism, or? At 2016, I mean, you were...
There's the optimism of early 2011 is certainly gone, but that was an optimism that was born out of this dramatic event, and it may have been too much optimism and too little reality that was tempering that optimism. People have had a lot of tempering over the past few years in Egypt. And they realize now that there's got to be some sort of balance between stability and change. And so finding out what what that right balance is, what is going to work. I don't think there are really very many people in Egypt who are looking at going back to what they had before, though there are some. There are some who say, look, we had it much better than we realized. The chaos proved that, and we ought to go back to what we had before. I think people realize that you can't put that revolutionary spirit back in a box and close that box, that it's out of the box and it's healthy to have that out of the box, but it's equally healthy to find a way to balance it against these other kinds of interests, and particularly how you have stability, how you have rule of law. These sorts of things, I think, are the kinds of things that are on people's minds. And how do you piece the economy back together? It's been very difficult for Egypt.
And doesn't Egypt also, I think I read this in the New York Times, doesn't Egypt have an extremely large population under age 30? Or?
Yeah, this is the case across the region.
Across the whole Middle East.
Right, known as the youth bulge. And so when you have systems that have this large group of young people with relatively few opportunities for meaningful jobs that are not only going to pay them a living wage, but sustain them through their lives in a meaningful way. With a lack of that, and a lack of the kind of opportunities that people can easily see that are enjoyed by others in the world. You only have to look at your phone and see what's going on in other parts of the world. Without that, the enormous degree of frustration that builds has been something that has been very, very difficult for governments in the region to address and to mitigate in any kind of way, because people can't easily be constrained anymore. They can't be duped. They can't be cut off from the rest of the world. They know what's going on. They know that other people
through the social media,
that they have other opportunities, and so why don't they have those opportunities? And that's an important piece of the story.
And then one other thing, I was listening to an interview you gave on WAMC. You were saying in the future of the Middle East, no matter what happens, who will rule, not rule, that I guess you use the term Islamic parties. I don't know, is there a wide range of Islamic parties? Will they always have a say in things? Will the parties that, say if Egypt went democratic or whatever, will the parties have some kind of Islamic component to them? Do all the parties have that over there? I'm not really...
Well, so in general terms, I think, and this gets back to the media and how the media reports on things, we tend to see parties that draw upon Islam as part of the way to legitimize themselves and to promote themselves. We tend to see them through the light of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or perhaps the Muslim Brotherhood. The reality is there's a wide spectrum of parties that use Islam in one way or another as a legitimizing tool. Most of them are not violent. Some have a more literalist approach to how you think about the application of Quranic principles with daily life. Many of them are much more flexible. So I think the thing to keep in mind is, in general, this is not a kind of a monochrome approach that we see many different kinds of parties across the region. With regard to Egypt, this is, again, I think, one of those issues where people are seeking to find a balance. Following the ouster of Mohamed Morsi as president in 2013, there was a sense that the Muslim Brotherhood had overreached, that in many cases people thought they had behaved illegally, and that they ought to be ousted from the political system, that they should be deemed terrorist, a terrorist organization, and therefore not eligible to participate in politics. It's up to Egyptians, I think, to find what that right balance is. How is it that parties that draw upon Islam can play some role in a system, knowing that there's a certain percentage of the population that supports those parties, that wants them in the political system, and that if you marginalize them, do you in fact just radicalize them all the more? The Muslim Brotherhood is not the only party in the Egyptian context that uses Islam. So there are other examples. It's just the oldest, the largest, and the most famous. It's a very difficult thing to find a balance for in each of the countries, and particularly in Egypt right now.
And what is Egypt? Are some countries, is it harder in some countries to get that balance, you think, than others, or as you look on the whole Middle East?
Well, I think we see a real struggle within the Middle East and North Africa to define what the role of Islam is going to be in terms of daily politics. So a country like Egypt, 10% of the population is Christian. Well, that's a sizable number in a country of close to 90 million people. What will be the role of those Christians to be able to be part of their political process if Islam dominates the narrative?
Yeah, okay.
And there are minorities across the Middle East and North Africa that struggle with this as well. So is it Islam that ought to be the defining quality that and what kind of Islam, whose version of Islam? These are the kind of debates that I think are happening within and among the people in the Middle East.
Well, why don't we end with this here? You can put on your professor hat, and could you recommend some books about the Middle East that you have found particularly that people watching might be interested in, that might give a good sense of what is current situation or some past history, that might be some really good books?
Well, I think that
or places they could go currently, maybe on the internet to read.
Sure. Well, that's I think important because things are changing so quickly. So to keep up with the news of what's happening in the Middle East and to move beyond the kind of standard media outlets in the U.S., I think Foreign Policy magazine has a great set of writers at fp.com.
Okay.
That's very good. Foreign Affairs is also very good. Those are both accessible to people who are experts in the region and those who are not. But I'm also a big proponent of reading books about the region that are not just political. There are some great novels about the Middle East. One that came out a little bit before the Egyptian Revolution, but I think does a very good job in capturing a variety of the important dynamics in Egypt in this century, is called the Yacubian Building by Ala El-Aswani. Okay. It's quite a famous book, translated into English, widely available, and in addition to being informative and educational, it's also just a great read.
Well, this goes back to what you were saying before about the everyday life. Not everything is political, is it?
That's right. That's right. I'd also encourage people to explore some of the music of the region. There's a great musical project called the Nile Project, which combines education, environmentalism, and musicians from across the Nile Basin, pulling together people from sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, and the Middle East. And their music is available online, and you get a real sense of not only the specific kinds of music from each of those participating countries, but how they can come together and create a new mixture.
Okay. Well, thank you for this insight into the Middle East, and particularly Egypt, and thank you for coming, and perhaps we'll see you at our library in the future.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and we'll see you next time on Getting to Know You.